It started the way most neighborhood nightmares do, quietly, almost invisibly, hiding behind rules that sounded reasonable and authority that hadn't yet been questioned. The neighborhood was marketed as peaceful, orderly, and protected by an HOA that promised to preserve property values and maintain harmony. At first glance, it looked like exactly that. Trimmed lawns, neutral-colored houses, identical mailboxes standing at attention like soldiers. Everything appeared calm, controlled, and predictable. That illusion began to crack the moment the driveway became a problem. The driveway had been there long before the current HOA board took shape. It was clearly mapped in county records, approved by the city, and attached to the property deed. It wasn't shared, it wasn't communal, it wasn't optional. It was the sole access point for parking, deliveries, and daily life. For years it functioned without issue. Cars came and went, trash trucks passed, guests parked briefly and left. Nothing unusual ever happened there. Then the new HOA board arrived, and with it came a woman who treated the neighborhood like her personal jurisdiction. She wasn't officially called Karen, of course. On paper, she was just a board member with a title that sounded harmless enough. But in practice, she moved like an enforcer. She watched everything. She documented everything. She corrected everything. Her presence was constant, even when she wasn't visible. Cameras appeared. Clipboards were always nearby. Notices began showing up for infractions no one remembered agreeing to. At first, the driveway wasn't targeted directly. The complaints started small and indirect. A note about improper parking visibility. A warning about fire lane proximity, despite no fire lane markings anywhere near the property. Then came the first obstruction. One morning, a vehicle was parked partially across the driveway entrance. Not fully blocking it, but close enough to make exiting difficult. It wasn't random. The car belonged to a frequent HOA volunteer, someone known to follow instructions without question. The obstruction lasted just long enough to be inconvenient, then disappeared. The next day it happened again. This time the block was more deliberate. The angle was tighter, the timing more precise. It occurred during the busiest hours of the morning, forcing a delayed departure and unnecessary stress. Still, it was easy to dismiss it as coincidence. Neighborhoods are full of minor annoyances. Overreacting felt premature, but the pattern didn't stop. Over the next week, the driveway was blocked repeatedly, sometimes by vehicles, other times by trash bins left directly in front of the entrance. Once, a temporary no parking sign appeared overnight, staked into the grass near the driveway, as if it had always belonged there. Each obstruction came and went without explanation, always returning the next day in a slightly different form. The common thread was timing. The blocks never occurred randomly. They always aligned with moments of inconvenience, early mornings, late evenings, delivery windows, and always, somewhere nearby, the same woman could be found watching, standing on a sidewalk, sitting in a car, pretending to examine landscaping while clearly monitoring the outcome. Complaints were filed through official channels, emails were sent, documentation was attached, property maps were referenced. Each response came back vague and dismissive, filled with carefully chosen language about temporary enforcement measures and ongoing safety reviews. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. Meanwhile, the obstructions escalated. What began as partial blocks turned into full ones. Vehicles were parked squarely across the driveway, sometimes for hours. On one occasion, construction cones were arranged with precision, forcing a detour that didn't exist. Another time, a landscaping truck was positioned directly in front of the entrance, engine off, driver nowhere in sight. The message was becoming clearer with each passing day. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about order. This was about control. The driveway had become a test. Each obstruction felt like a provocation, daring a reaction. And with every delay, every forced workaround, the frustration grew, not just at the inconvenience, but at the audacity. This wasn't public land. This wasn't a shared resource. This was private property being treated like a chessboard square in someone else's game. Neighbors noticed but said little. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered sympathetic looks without words. a few whispered warnings about how things work now, and advised compliance as the safest route. It was clear that resistance carried a reputation here, and reputations traveled fast. Still, compliance didn't come. Instead, everything was documented. Photos were taken, timestamps were recorded, county ordinances were reviewed, property surveys were retrieved and printed. Every obstruction was catalogued meticulously, not out of paranoia, but out of preparation. Because beneath the surface frustration, something else was forming. A realization. The HOA's power depended on assumptions that residents wouldn't push back, assumptions that inconvenience would eventually wear people down, assumptions that authority, even when misused, would go unchallenged. But assumptions break when faced with permanence. The idea didn't arrive suddenly. It formed gradually, piece by piece, as each obstruction made the driveway feel less like an access point and more like a battleground. Temporary blocks were easy to place, easy to remove, easy to deny responsibility for. What wasn't easy was moving something designed never to move at all. Landscaping regulations were reviewed next. The HOA had strict guidelines about aesthetics, but surprisingly little language about weight. Decorative features were allowed. Planters were encouraged. Stone elements were even praised in community newsletters. And stone, unlike cones or cars, didn't apologize. It didn't relocate politely. It didn't budge. The more the idea took shape, the more obvious it became. If the driveway entrance was being treated like shared space, then the boundary needed to be made undeniable. Not with signs, not with arguments, but with mass, with gravity, with something that turned the abstract concept of private property into a physical reality. Research followed, suppliers were contacted, specifications were reviewed, weight estimates were calculated carefully, not decorative pottery, not movable landscaping. These would be industrial-grade stone planters, each weighing 4 tons when filled, too heavy to drag, too heavy to push, too heavy to ignore. The plan wasn't revenge, it wasn't even confrontation, it was resolution. If the driveway was being blocked daily, then the daily block would be eliminated permanently. No warnings, no debates, just an immovable solution placed precisely where ambiguity had been exploited. By the time the delivery date was scheduled, the driveway had been blocked 11 times in 14 days. Each instance was logged. Each response from the HOA grew shorter and colder, and each morning brought the same question: what would be in the way today? But beneath that question was another, quieter one. What would happen when the blocking stopped, not because of permission, but because it had become physically impossible? That answer was coming soon. And when it arrived, it wouldn't be something the HOA could email away. The planters were already on their way. The days leading up to the delivery felt strangely calm, like the quiet before a storm no one else could see forming. The driveway continued to be blocked almost on schedule now, as if the pattern itself had become part of the neighborhood routine. A car across the entrance in the morning, trash bins nudged just far enough to obstruct in the afternoon, cones reappearing after sunset, placed with a precision that suggested intention rather than accident. What changed wasn't the behavior, it was the perspective. Each obstruction no longer felt like a personal attack. Instead, it felt like evidence. Confirmation that the problem wasn't misunderstanding or miscommunication, but entitlement. The belief that power could exist without consequence, that private property could be treated as flexible so long as the person bending the rules believed they were right. The HOA emails continued, but their tone shifted. Where there had once been vague explanations, there was now defensiveness. References to community standards grew more frequent, even though no standard actually justified the behavior. The driveway wasn't mentioned by name anymore. Instead, the language danced around it, careful not to admit what was happening while still asserting authority over it. Meanwhile, preparations moved forward quietly. The planters weren't impulse purchases. Each one was selected deliberately: reinforced stone, thick walls, wide bases designed for permanence. When filled with soil and anchored properly, each planter would weigh close to 4 tons. They weren't decorative accents meant to be admired from a distance. They were boundaries. Permits were checked twice. Local ordinances were reviewed again. Nothing prohibited heavy landscaping features on private property, especially when they didn't obstruct sidewalks or roadways. The placement was legal, the purpose was clear, and unlike signs or paint, stone didn't require approval from anyone who didn't own the land beneath it. The delivery company asked routine questions. Where should the truck park? Was there sufficient clearance? Would a crane be required? All of it was handled professionally without drama. To them, it was just another job. They had no idea the quiet chaos their arrival would cause. The night before delivery, the driveway was blocked more aggressively than ever. A vehicle was parked fully across the entrance, bumper nearly touching the curb on one side and extending just enough on the other to make maneuvering impossible. It stayed there for hours. No calls were made, no notes were left. The obstruction was photographed, logged, and left exactly as it was. For the first time, there was no frustration, only anticipation. Morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of day that made everything feel exposed. The neighborhood was already stirring when the delivery truck pulled in. It was large, industrial, impossible to ignore. The sound of hydraulics echoed through the street as it maneuvered into position. Heads turned, curtains shifted, a few doors opened briefly, then closed again. The blocked driveway was still obstructed when the truck arrived, and that was the moment when things began to unravel for the HOA's quiet authority. The delivery crew didn't argue, they didn't complain, they simply documented the obstruction and adjusted their approach. With practiced efficiency, they positioned the crane and began unloading. The first planter descended slowly, suspended in the air like a declaration. When it touched down, the sound was unmistakable, a deep, solid impact that carried through the ground itself. This wasn't something temporary. This wasn't something that could be nudged aside later. The second planter followed, then the third. Each one was placed with precision, aligned carefully along the edge of the driveway entrance, not blocking it, not encroaching on any shared space, just enough to make the boundary unmistakable. The driveway was now framed by stone, heavy, immovable, and unapologetic. By the time the fourth planter was set, the neighborhood had fully taken notice. Phones were out. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The same HOA board member who had lingered during previous obstructions was suddenly very visible, standing across the street with an expression that shifted between disbelief and outrage. She didn't approach. She didn't intervene. She simply watched as the last planter settled into place. The blocked vehicle was still there. For the first time since the harassment began, the obstruction looked out of place. Not defiant, not strategic, just foolish, trapped between a public road and a line of stone that clearly marked where authority ended. When the delivery crew finished, they didn't linger. Paperwork was signed, equipment was packed up. The truck pulled away, leaving behind silence and 4 massive planters that instantly redefined the space. It didn't take long for the reaction to begin. An email arrived before noon, marked urgent, filled with accusations disguised as concerns. The planters were described as hostile, non-compliant, and disruptive to community flow. There was no mention of the weeks of obstruction that led to their placement. No acknowledgement of the driveway being blocked repeatedly, just outrage that the situation was no longer controllable. The response was simple and documented. Property lines were attached, permits were referenced, photos of previous obstructions were included, complete with dates and times. The message was factual, unemotional, and final. The planters were legal, the driveway was private, the issue was resolved. The blocked vehicle eventually moved, but the energy it left behind lingered. The driveway was suddenly respected, not because of courtesy, but because it demanded respect. There was no space left for ambiguity, no room for creative enforcement. Stone doesn't negotiate. Neighbors began to talk more openly now. Some expressed quiet admiration, others admitted they'd experienced similar issues but hadn't known how to stop them. A few looked nervous, realizing that the HOA's authority wasn't as absolute as they'd believed. The woman who had overseen the blocking stopped appearing near the driveway. Her presence in the neighborhood became less frequent, less confident. The clipboards disappeared. The notes stopped arriving. But the story wasn't over. Because while the physical obstruction had ended, the challenge to authority had only just begun. The planters had done more than protect a driveway. They had exposed a power struggle the HOA wasn't prepared to lose. And behind the scenes, retaliation was already taking shape. The silence that followed the installation of the planters was not peaceful. It was calculated. For the first time since the harassment began, the driveway remained clear for days in a row, and that alone felt unnatural. No cars appeared where they didn't belong. No bins drifted into place overnight. No cones materialized at dusk. The boundary held, and the neighborhood seemed to collectively hold its breath. That kind of quiet doesn't happen by accident. Behind closed doors, the HOA was regrouping. Authority that relies on intimidation doesn't disappear when challenged, it adapts. And while the driveway could no longer be physically blocked, the board still had other tools at its disposal: paperwork, fines, technicalities, the administrative machinery that could make life inconvenient without ever touching a stone planter. The first notice arrived 3 days after the installation. It wasn't about the driveway. It wasn't even about the planters directly. Instead, it cited a landscaping review discrepancy, claiming that the new features had not been submitted for aesthetic approval. The language was dense and formal, designed to intimidate through complexity rather than clarity. It referenced bylaws few residents had ever read in full, sections buried deep in documents written to favor interpretation over fairness. What it didn't reference was legality. The response followed the same pattern as before: measured, documented, unemotional. The planters were permanent landscaping elements, installed fully within property lines, compliant with all municipal regulations. HOA guidelines were reviewed carefully. Nowhere did they require approval for non-structural landscaping that did not affect shared spaces. The notice was acknowledged, not accepted. The next tactic came quickly. A follow-up letter accused the planters of creating visual obstruction concerns for passing vehicles, despite their placement being set back farther than existing hedges throughout the neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost. For weeks, actual vehicles had blocked the driveway with no concern for visibility at all. Now, stationary stone was suddenly a danger. Again, the response included photos, measurements, comparisons to other landscaping features already approved in the community. The inconsistency was undeniable, and the paper trail grew thicker with each exchange. That was when the fines began. Small at first, minor administrative penalties applied retroactively to previous dates. The charges were vague, labeled with general terms like non-compliance review fee and corrective assessment. Each one was contested immediately, and each contest added another layer of documentation. The HOA's strategy was becoming clear. If they couldn't move the planters, they would bury the homeowner in process, wear them down with bureaucracy, force a retreat through exhaustion rather than force. But exhaustion never came. Every letter was answered, every fine was disputed, every claim was countered with evidence, county records, photographs, email threads, timelines that showed not just what was happening, but when and how it had escalated. And then something unexpected happened. Other homeowners started paying attention. The planters had become a symbol, not because of their size, but because of what they represented. For years, residents had quietly tolerated overreach, believing resistance wasn't worth the trouble. But now, they were watching someone challenge that assumption and succeed. Questions started circulating. Why had the driveway been blocked in the first place? Why was the HOA suddenly so aggressive about landscaping when other violations went unaddressed? Why were fines being issued without clear justification? The board's authority, once assumed to be absolute, was now being examined. Meetings grew tense. Attendance increased. Faces that hadn't been seen in months showed up with notebooks and printed copies of bylaws. The same woman who had once dominated discussions now found herself facing scrutiny. Her explanations grew longer, more defensive. The confidence she once projected began to fracture under questioning. The driveway issue was no longer isolated, it had become a case study. One homeowner shared their own experience with selective enforcement. Another mentioned fines that had been issued and then quietly withdrawn when challenged. Patterns emerged. Patterns that suggested the HOA's power wasn't just firm, but arbitrary. Meanwhile, the planters sat unmoved. They became part of the neighborhood's visual landscape, impossible to ignore and impossible to argue with. Children climbed on them. Birds perched on their edges. They were no longer controversial objects. They were fixtures. And that permanence mattered. The HOA escalated again, this time attempting to call for a special compliance review. The language was urgent, the deadline tight. It demanded removal of the planters pending further evaluation. No justification, no explanation of authority, just a demand. The response was brief. The planters were not being removed. Any further communication on the matter would need to include legal justification under municipal code, not HOA preference. All future notices would be forwarded to legal counsel. That was the moment the tone shifted. Emails slowed, letters stopped arriving daily. The board, now aware that every move was being documented and potentially exposed, became cautious. The woman who had initiated the harassment grew quieter still, her influence within the board visibly diminished. But power rarely retreats gracefully. Instead, it looks for allies. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of zoning violations, suggestions that the property might be re-evaluated for compliance unrelated to the driveway. The intent was clear: to intimidate, to isolate, to regain control through fear. None of it worked. The evidence was too solid, the support too visible. What had started as a personal boundary dispute had grown into a broader challenge to the HOA's unchecked authority, and somewhere in the background, someone made a mistake. A document surfaced, an internal email, forwarded accidentally to the wrong recipient. It referenced the driveway obstructions not as safety measures, but as pressure tactics. The language was casual, unguarded, and devastating. It was proof that the blocking had been intentional. Proof that the enforcement had been targeted. Proof that the HOA's actions weren't about rules, but about control. That email changed everything. Because once intention is exposed, consequences follow. And the next chapter would no longer be about defense. It would be about accountability. The email didn't explode into the neighborhood all at once. It spread quietly, like a crack running through glass before the shatter. At first, only a few people saw it, then a few more. By the end of the week, it had reached nearly every homeowner who had ever questioned an HOA notice and wondered if they were imagining the bias behind it. The language inside the message was unmistakable. There were no legal disclaimers, no careful phrasing, just a casual acknowledgement that blocking the driveway had been a deliberate tactic meant to encourage compliance. It framed inconvenience as leverage and frustration as a tool. It was written with the confidence of someone who had never expected to be held accountable. Once that confidence was gone, everything changed. The board tried to contain the damage at first. The email was described as misinterpreted, then taken out of context, then finally dismissed as informal communication not reflective of board policy. But explanations only work when there isn't a paper trail, and by now the trail was undeniable. Screenshots circulated. Printouts appeared at doorsteps. Conversations that once happened in whispers now took place openly on sidewalks and in driveways. The same neighbors who had avoided eye contact weeks earlier were suddenly asking detailed questions about bylaws, enforcement authority, and recall procedures. The driveway was no longer the story. The story was power. A special HOA meeting was announced with unusually short notice. The agenda was vague, listing only community concerns and policy clarification. That vagueness didn't calm anyone, it alarmed them. Attendance tripled compared to previous meetings, filling the room with a tension that had been building for years. The board members sat at the front, but the dynamic was different now. The woman who had once commanded attention found herself the focus of it instead. Every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word was scrutinized. The email was brought up early. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches. The weight of the moment came from something quieter, the collective realization that the authority everyone had deferred to was far more fragile than it appeared. Questions were asked calmly, but they cut deep. Why were certain properties targeted while others were ignored? Why were enforcement actions taken without documentation? Why did internal communication describe harassment as strategy? The answers were evasive. They always are when the truth is inconvenient. As the meeting dragged on, something else became clear. The board was divided. Not everyone had agreed with the tactics. Some members had been uncomfortable but silent, assuming resistance would only make things worse. Now, with evidence in the open, silence became complicity, and that was a position fewer people were willing to maintain. A motion was raised to commission an independent review of enforcement practices, another to suspend discretionary penalties until that review was complete. Each motion passed narrowly, but decisively. The woman at the center of it all said little. Her authority had been built on momentum, not consensus, and momentum had shifted. In the days that followed, the HOA's posture softened noticeably. Fines previously issued were paused pending review. Notices were retracted. Language in emails became cautious, almost apologetic. The sudden change would have felt satisfying if it hadn't been so revealing. It confirmed what many had suspected, that the aggression had always been optional. But accountability doesn't end with softened language. The independent review uncovered more than expected. Patterns of selective enforcement, inconsistent penalties, instances where board members acted without proper votes or documentation. What had been dismissed for years as overzealousness now looked more like systematic overreach. The driveway incident stood out not because it was unique, but because it was documented so thoroughly. It became the clearest example of how far the HOA was willing to go when challenged, and how quickly that approach collapsed under scrutiny. Pressure mounted. Calls for resignation began circulating, not loud, not angry, just persistent. Residents who had never spoken at meetings before started doing so. They weren't looking for revenge. They wanted change, structure, limits. The board responded by attempting to reframe the narrative. They emphasized the importance of unity, of moving forward, of learning from mistakes. But unity without accountability rang hollow, and learning without consequences felt performative. Eventually, the inevitable happened. The woman who had initiated the harassment stepped down from her board position. The announcement was brief, citing personal reasons and a desire to reduce tension within the community. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of harm, just an exit. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like closure. Because the point had never been to remove someone from power, it had been to establish that power had limits, and that those limits could be enforced by ordinary people who refused to be pushed around. The planters remained untouched throughout it all. They had become more than stone containers. They were markers of a moment when abstract rights became physical realities, when boundaries were no longer theoretical, but visible and immovable. Neighbors began to decorate them seasonally. Flowers appeared, small lights were added. What had once been a symbol of conflict became part of the community's identity, a reminder that standing up didn't have to be loud to be effective. But the story wasn't finished yet, because while the HOA had been forced to reckon with its actions, the neighborhood itself was still adjusting to a new reality, one where authority could be questioned and where private property meant exactly what it said. And in that adjustment, new challenges were waiting. After the resignation, the neighborhood entered an unfamiliar phase. It wasn't celebration, and it wasn't relief. It was something quieter and more uncertain, a recalibration. For years, routines had been shaped around avoiding trouble, staying unnoticed, and complying preemptively. Now, those habits no longer made sense, but nothing had replaced them yet. The HOA still existed. The rules were still there. But the fear that had once hovered over every interaction was gone, and in its absence, people began to notice how much space it had occupied. The board reorganized quickly. Interim members were appointed. Committees were formed to review enforcement policies, rewrite communication guidelines, and establish clearer limits on authority. Everything was labeled transparent now, even when it wasn't. Still, the shift was real enough to feel. The driveway remained clear without effort. No cars drifted into the entrance. No bins mysteriously rolled into place. No cones appeared overnight. The absence of obstruction felt strange at first, like waiting for a habit to resume that no longer existed. But days passed, then weeks, and the pattern held. The boundary had been accepted, not grudgingly, but completely. That acceptance carried weight. Neighbors who had once avoided each other began talking more, not just about the HOA, but about everything the HOA had once overshadowed. Lawn projects, home repairs, small changes that people had delayed out of fear of triggering enforcement. The neighborhood felt more human, less curated. The planters played a quiet role in that transformation. They were still heavy, still immovable, but they no longer felt confrontational. They were just part of the landscape now, anchoring the driveway the same way confidence anchored the homeowner's sense of security. Still, not everyone adjusted easily. There were residents who had benefited from the old system, people who enjoyed the protection of selective enforcement, who liked having someone else targeted instead of them. For them, the change felt like loss. Their complaints grew sharper, their emails more frequent. They tested the new board, probing for weakness. But the new board had learned from the past. Each complaint was handled carefully, documented thoroughly, and addressed publicly when appropriate. No private enforcement, no quiet favors. The processes were slow, sometimes frustratingly so, but they were consistent. And consistency, more than authority, earned trust. A neighborhood-wide audit of fines and penalties was completed. Several were refunded, others were formally voided. The explanations were clinical, almost cold, but they mattered. They acknowledged harm without dramatizing it, which in some ways made them more powerful. The driveway incident was referenced less and less, but it was never forgotten. It had become shorthand for a larger lesson. When discussions turned toward enforcement limits or board power, someone would inevitably mention what happened with the driveway, and everyone would understand exactly what that meant. No elaboration required. The woman who had resigned faded from the neighborhood entirely. Her house went up for sale quietly, without signage or announcement. When it sold, no one commented publicly. Some absences don't need explanation. Life settled into something close to normal. But normal had changed. The homeowner found themselves noticing things they hadn't before. The ease of pulling into the driveway without scanning for obstructions, the freedom of making improvements without anticipating retaliation, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the land they lived on was finally respected as theirs. There was also something else, a shift inward. Standing firm had done more than stop harassment. It had rewritten assumptions about power, about who gets to define rules and who gets to enforce them, about how often people surrender ground not because they're wrong, but because they're tired. The planters had been a practical solution, but the decision behind them had been philosophical. It had asked a simple question: if authority is being misused, why treat it as legitimate? That question lingered. It showed up in other parts of life. In work, in relationships, in moments where convenience had once overridden principle. The driveway had become a turning point, not just in the neighborhood, but in mindset. Still, there was one final test ahead. The HOA announced new elections. For the first time in years, there was real interest, multiple candidates, platforms, promises of restraint and accountability. The process wasn't dramatic, but it was engaged. People voted who hadn't bothered before. They paid attention. When the results were announced, the board looked different, more diverse, less performative, less eager to enforce for the sake of enforcing. The change wasn't perfect, it never is, but it was durable. The planters remained exactly where they had been placed on that first delivery day. They hadn't moved an inch, and no one had tried to move them. They no longer needed to prove anything. What they had started, however, was still unfolding. Because the real impact of standing up to overreach isn't always immediate. Sometimes it shows itself slowly in how people treat each other afterward, in what they tolerate, and in what they no longer accept as just the way things are. And as the neighborhood continued to evolve, one truth became impossible to ignore. The driveway hadn't just been defended, it had redefined the meaning of ownership in a place that had almost forgotten it. Time did what conflict never could. It settled everything into perspective. Months passed, and then a full year, and the driveway remained exactly as it had been since the day the planters were installed, clear, respected, uneventful. What once felt like contested ground had become invisible again, not because it was ignored, but because it was no longer questioned. That was the true victory. The neighborhood continued to change in subtle ways, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to matter. The HOA meetings grew shorter, agendas became specific instead of vague. Enforcement reports were written with citations instead of opinions. The language of power shifted from command to explanation, and that alone transformed how rules were received. People stopped whispering. When issues arose, they were discussed openly. When disagreements happened, they were documented and resolved without intimidation. The fear that had once kept residents compliant had been replaced with something sturdier, mutual awareness. The driveway planters became a quiet landmark. New residents asked about them occasionally, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. They were told the story in fragments, simplified over time, a disagreement, a boundary, a solution. The dramatic edges softened, but the lesson remained intact. Private property meant something here now. Not because the HOA had changed its language, but because the community had changed its expectations. Authority was no longer assumed to be correct by default. It was expected to justify itself. That expectation alone kept it in check. The homeowner rarely thought about the conflict anymore. The energy once spent documenting obstructions and responding to emails had been redirected toward living, gardening around the planters, improving the home, hosting friends without worrying about enforcement notices appearing afterward. What remained was a sense of clarity. The realization that rights don't disappear just because someone louder claims control over them. That permanence, when used responsibly, can be a form of communication. And that sometimes the most effective response to harassment isn't escalation, but resolution. The HOA never formally apologized. That wasn't surprising. Institutions rarely do. But their behavior told a different story. One of restraint, caution, and an understanding that they had crossed a line once and wouldn't be allowed to do so again. That understanding was enough. The woman who had once wielded her authority so confidently became a footnote in the neighborhood's history, not demonized, not celebrated, just remembered as the reason things were different now. Her absence left no void, because nothing of value had depended on her presence. The planters remained filled with life. Flowers changed with the seasons, soil settled, roots took hold. What had been installed as a defensive measure became something generative, supporting growth instead of conflict. And that transformation mattered, because it reframed the entire experience. What began as daily harassment ended not in bitterness but in stability. Not in victory over someone else, but in reclaiming something fundamental, the right to exist without interference on land that was legally and morally one's own. Looking back, it was clear that the driveway had never really been the issue. It had just been the place where control was tested, where assumptions collided with reality, where someone learned that private property isn't defined by who enforces it, but by who stands firm when it's challenged. The solution hadn't been loud, it hadn't been cruel. It had been heavy, deliberate, and permanent, 4 tons at a time. And in that weight, a lesson settled into the ground alongside the stone, unmovable, unmistakable, and quietly respected by everyone who passed it. The driveway stayed clear. The boundary held. And the story ended not with confrontation, but with something far rarer in HOA drama: peace. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.